The night of March 17, 1944, northern France. A British commando raid has just gone catastrophically wrong. In the pre-dawn darkness, a young Royal Signals corporal regains consciousness in the back of a German military truck, his hands bound, his head throbbing. His name, which we'll call Corporal James Henley for this retelling, would remain classified for decades. But his story reveals one of the most brilliant acts of quick thinking under pressure in the entire Second World War. Henley was a radio operator attached to a reconnaissance unit operating behind enemy lines. He carried something far more valuable than a weapon: current radio codes and authentication procedures that could compromise an entire network of operations if they fell into German hands. The raid had been routine, too routine. A suspected observation post, a quick strike, then extraction before dawn. But the Germans had been waiting. The ambush was swift and brutal. Most of his unit withdrew in the chaos, but Henley was caught in the open, scrambling to destroy his cipher materials when the rifle butt struck his temple. Now, as the truck rumbled toward a Gestapo facility in ruin, Henley knew exactly what awaited him. The Wehrmacht had become sophisticated in their interrogation techniques by 1944. They knew that the first hours after capture were critical, before prisoners could compose themselves, before codes could be changed. What the Germans didn't know was that Henley had something in his battle dress pocket, a creased, dirty field map covered in what appeared to be meaningless pencil marks, random scratches, coordinates that led nowhere, compass bearings that made no tactical sense. It was about to become the most important prop of his life. To understand Henley's predicament, we need to understand the invisible war being fought in radio waves above occupied Europe in 1944. British radio codes operated on time-sensitive rotation. Each signal unit received daily code groups, typically valid for 24 hours before expiring. These weren't simple substitution ciphers. By 1944, British forces used one-time pad systems for critical communications, with three-part authentication protocols. If a German interrogator could extract a valid code group within its active window, the consequences would cascade rapidly. They could inject false messages into the British communication network. They could identify unit positions. Most critically, they could compromise ongoing operations, like the massive deception campaign surrounding the coming D-Day landings just weeks away. The Germans understood this perfectly. Their Signals Intelligence Service maintained dedicated interrogation facilities specifically for captured radio operators, staffed by officers who understood encryption systems and psychological pressure points. These interrogators had refined their techniques. They knew physical torture often produced unreliable information. Instead, they preferred psychological pressure, isolation, sleep deprivation, threats of execution, most effectively, exploitation of a prisoner's fear for his comrades. Tell us the codes and we won't pursue your unit. Cooperate and your friends escape. For a 22-year-old signaller, already exhausted and possibly concussed, the pressure would be immense. But Henley had one advantage. His training had included one crucial principle: if you can't avoid talking, talk about something useless. Give them a puzzle that leads nowhere. Buy time. The facility in Rouen was a converted school building. Henley was processed with bureaucratic efficiency, searched, photographed, his possessions catalogued, the field map was confiscated, along with his compass and dog tags. Then came the wait. 12 hours in a bare cell. No food, water once. The psychological preparation before questioning. When the door finally opened, the interrogator was not what Henley expected. No screaming Gestapo officer. Instead, an Abwehrhauptmann, a captain in military intelligence, perhaps 40, wearing a Wehrmacht uniform with an Afrika Korps ribbon. He spoke perfect English with barely an accent. "Corporal Henley," he began, settling into the room's only chair. "I am Hauptmann Weber. We have much to discuss." The interrogation began with deceptive casualness. Weber already knew Henley's name, rank, and unit from his dog tags. But then came the shift. "You are a signaller. This means you know current codes." Weber's tone remained conversational, almost friendly. "The question is not whether you will tell me. Time will ensure that. The question is whether you tell me while those codes are still useful, or after your stubbornness has achieved nothing." He paused. Your unit has escaped. Your mission failed. The codes in your head are the only thing that matters now. Help me understand them. And this conversation ends quickly. Henley said nothing, but his mind was racing. His codes were valid until midnight, roughly 9 hours away. If he could remain silent until then, the intelligence would become worthless. 9 hours felt like an eternity. The interrogation continued for 3 hours. Eber alternated between patient questioning and veiled threats. Henley stuck to name, rank, and serial number, but he could feel his resistance eroding. The concussion made his thoughts sluggish. Exhaustion pulled at his concentration. During a brief pause, while Weber consulted papers at the door with another officer, Henley's gaze fell on the table. His confiscated possessions lay spread out there, including the creased field map, and in that moment of exhausted clarity, an idea formed. The map was genuine, standard British military issue. But over the past weeks, Henley had absently drawn on it during long radio watches, pencil marks at coordinates, random bearings, what looked like coded grid references. None of it meant anything. It was idle scribbling, killing time between transmissions. But to someone looking for hidden information, someone primed to believe that a clever signaler might conceal codes in plain sight, it could look like something far more significant. When Weber returned, Henley made his move. He allowed panic to show in his face, not difficult given his situation. His eyes darted to the map, then away. A classic tell. Weber noticed immediately. The map interests you, he said, picking it up. Why? Henley shook his head, trying to appear evasive. It's nothing. Just a map. Corporal. You would not risk a glance at nothing during such a conversation. Weber smoothed the map on the table, studying the pencil marks. These markings, they appear random, but perhaps they are not. This was the critical moment. Henley had to sell the deception without being obvious. He let his shoulders slump, a man whose secret had been discovered. They're backup references, he said quietly, in case I lost my codebook. The numbers correspond to coordinates, but they're keyed to. He stopped, as if catching himself. Keyed to what? Weber leaned forward. I can't tell you that. Weber studied him for a long moment, then called the guard. Rapid German followed, and Henley was removed from the room. Through the door, he could see Weber bent over the map with another officer, both examining the pencil marks intently. The gambit was in play. The beauty of the deception was its unfalsifiability. There was no hidden code to crack. Weber could spend hours trying to extract meaning from markings that contained none. Every hour was an hour closer to midnight. What Henley couldn't see was the intense activity his deception had triggered. Weber, convinced he'd discovered something significant, immediately escalated to his superior officer. The map was photographed, copies distributed to the facility's cryptanalysis section, former mathematics professors and signals experts who specialized in breaking Allied codes. The pencil markings became the focus of intense scrutiny. The German analysts saw 6-digit numbers scattered across the map: 2345171182934578821. They appeared to be grid references, but when plotted, they didn't correspond to any known military installations. Were they encrypted? Did they reference a different map? Or were they keyed to a book cipher? Compass bearings drawn from various points: 127 degrees from one village, 283 degrees from a crossroads. When traced, the lines intersected at seemingly random locations, but perhaps the intersection points were the message. Or maybe the angles, when converted through some algorithm, would yield the code groups. Abbreviated coordinates, NA 4.2 inches or SW 7.8 inches, with arrows pointing to terrain features. Distance markers, map overlay references, components of a complex encryption system. The analysts worked through the night. They tried every standard cryptographic approach. They plotted coordinates on multiple map scales. They tested whether the numbers corresponded to radio frequencies, map sheet numbers, or military unit designations. Weber returned to interrogate Henley again, but his approach had changed. He was no longer seeking confession. He was seeking clarification. The coordinates on your map, they reference points along the coast. Are these landing zones? Henley, barely believing his deception was working, played his role carefully. He showed fear but not cooperation. He denied nothing but confirmed nothing. "I've told you too much already," became his repeated response. The psychology worked in Henley's favor. Weber had professional pride invested. He'd reported a potential intelligence breakthrough. His superiors expected results. The natural human tendency is to keep pursuing an investigation once you've committed to it. This was magnified by the context of 1944. German intelligence was under enormous pressure. The Allies were clearly preparing for invasion. Every scrap of information was desperately needed. A captured signaler's map, seemingly containing encoded references, fit perfectly into their expectations. So they kept analyzing, hour after hour. At 2300 hours on March 18th, the radio codes in Henley's memory officially expired. British signals units switched to the next day's code groups. The map had bought exactly the time Henley needed. To understand why such a simple ruse succeeded against trained interrogators, we need to examine the psychology at play. First, cognitive priming. Weber and his team were actively looking for hidden codes. They expected British soldiers to employ clever concealment. This expectation created perceptual bias. They were more likely to see patterns in ambiguous information because they anticipated finding them. Second, complexity bias. When presented with two possibilities, meaningless doodles or sophisticated encryption, trained analysts tend toward the complex explanation. Simple answers feel like failures. Complex answers feel like breakthroughs. Third, Henley's behavior sold it perfectly. He didn't volunteer the map's significance. Weber discovered it. He didn't explain the system. He resisted explaining it. This resistance made the supposed code seem more valuable. If Henley was protecting it, it must be worth protecting. Fourth, time pressure worked in Henley's favor. Weber knew codes were time-sensitive, creating urgency to crack the map before the information expired. But this urgency discouraged stepping back to question whether they were pursuing a genuine lead at all. Finally, institutional momentum. Once Weber reported a potential breakthrough, admitting he'd wasted hours on meaningless doodles would be professionally embarrassing. Better to keep analyzing, keep searching. This combination, expectation, complexity bias, behavioral confirmation, time pressure, and institutional commitment, created perfect misdirection. The Germans essentially interrogated themselves, finding elaborate explanations for marks that had no explanation. It's a masterclass in how psychology can be exploited even by highly trained professionals. The more sophisticated your analytical tools, the more elaborate the patterns you can imagine in random data. Sometimes the best deception is giving someone exactly what they expect to find, knowing they'll be too busy analyzing it to question whether it's real. The days following his interrogation settled into grim routine. Weber continued questioning Henley about the map, but with diminishing intensity. The urgency was gone. The value had decreased. Henley was transferred to Stalag Luft 3 prisoner of war camp. His status as a signals operator made him valuable for possible exchange, but the immediate threat had passed. During camp processing, British intelligence officers, prisoners themselves, but part of MI9's clandestine organization, debriefed him carefully. The story of the map deception was noted, coded into secret communications, and eventually transmitted back to London. Henley remained a prisoner for the rest of the war. He survived the forced march westward in early 1945 and was finally liberated by American forces in April. His interrogation report praised his exceptional presence of mind under extreme pressure. His approach, creating a false puzzle rather than simply refusing to speak, became part of expanded training programs for signals personnel. But Henley himself disappeared from the historical record after demobilization. The Official Secrets Act kept him from discussing his experience publicly. Even his family knew only that he'd been a POW, not the circumstances of his capture or the clever gambit that had saved his comrades. The map itself survived in German intelligence files and was recovered by British investigators during post-war examination of captured Wehrmacht records. It's now held in the National Archives, a testament to how random pencil marks became one of the most intensely studied documents of the European war. The interrogator, Hauptmann Weber, survived the war and was briefly detained during Allied screening. In his statement, He made no mention of the map incident, perhaps embarrassed by the deception, perhaps not even recognizing he'd been deceived at all. He maintained that British signals security was remarkably sophisticated, never realizing one of his most frustrating cases had been nothing more than a signaler's boredom scribbles. Henley's small victory was part of a much larger intelligence war, being fought across occupied Europe in 1944. The stakes of signals intelligence in this period cannot be overstated. The Allied invasion of France, Operation Overlord, was scheduled for early June, just weeks after Henley's capture. The entire operation depended on elaborate deception campaigns that used false radio traffic and controlled information leaks to convince the Germans that invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. If German interrogators had cracked British radio codes in March 1944, they could have potentially identified patterns revealing true invasion preparations. More immediately, they could have monitored specific unit movements or even injected false orders into British command networks. This was not theoretical. The Germans had successfully penetrated Allied communications before. In 1942, the Africa Corps intercepted and decoded communications from the American military attaché in Cairo, providing Rommel with detailed intelligence on British force dispositions. By 1944, however, Allied signals security had dramatically improved. Code rotation became more frequent. Authentication procedures became more rigorous, and critically, personnel were better trained in interrogation resistance. What's remarkable is how many small individual acts of resistance, like Henley's, collectively maintained the security that made larger operations possible. German intelligence in Western Europe was systematically confused about Allied intentions throughout spring 1944. They had fragments of accurate information, but couldn't assemble them into a coherent picture. Part of this confusion resulted from elaborate Allied deception operations, but part was simpler. Captured soldiers didn't break. Radio operators didn't reveal codes. The human element of security, the courage and cleverness of individuals under extreme pressure, proved just as important as cryptographic sophistication. In the grand sweep of World War II history, one corporal's clever deception might seem insignificant, but multiply it by thousands of similar small victories, and you begin to see how the Allies maintained the information advantage that proved decisive. The post-war analysis of Henley's case, along with hundreds of similar interrogation reports, fundamentally shaped how Allied forces approached interrogation resistance training. The primary lesson was counterintuitive. Sometimes the best defense is not silence, but misdirection. A prisoner who refuses to speak becomes a challenge to be broken. A prisoner who appears to cooperate while providing worthless information can satisfy the interrogator's need for results without compromising actual intelligence. This principle was incorporated into post-1945 SEER training programs: survival, evasion, resistance, escape. Trainees were taught to prepare legend stories, false but plausible narratives that could be revealed under pressure. The map deception also demonstrated the power of physical props. Henley's pencil marks were far more convincing than any verbal lie because they were tangible, analyzable objects. Interrogators naturally trust physical evidence more than verbal testimony. Another critical lesson was understanding your interrogator's expectations and biases. Henley succeeded because he understood what Weber wanted to believe, that a British signaler would use clever concealment methods. By confirming these expectations rather than contradicting them, he created a deception that felt true even as it led nowhere. The case also highlighted the value of time as a tactical resource. Modern intelligence has a shelf life, codes expire, operations conclude. Simply delaying information disclosure can render that information worthless. Finally, the story demonstrated that effective resistance doesn't require elaborate training or special equipment. Henley had minimal preparation, no specialized tools, and no support network. What he had was quick thinking, basic psychological insight, and courage to attempt a desperate improvisation. The story of Corporal Henley and his meaningless map is not a tale of dramatic heroism or daring escape. It's something perhaps more valuable, a reminder that intelligence, composure, and creativity can be as powerful as courage or strength. Henley was an ordinary soldier facing an extraordinary situation. He had no special training, no elaborate preparation, no support network. What he had was the presence of mind to recognize an opportunity and the courage to gamble on it. In his darkest hour, exhausted, injured, and isolated, he managed to think clearly enough to turn a piece of trash into a tactical weapon. His deception worked not because it was sophisticated, but because it was simple enough to improvise and clever enough to exploit his captor's assumptions. The pencil marks on that field map, random scribblings with no meaning, became one of the most analyzed documents in German intelligence files for March 1944. The broader lesson extends far beyond World War II interrogation rooms. In any high-pressure situation where information is power, the ability to control what others believe you know can be as valuable as what you actually know. We don't know what became of Corporal Henley after the war. He returned to private life, his story classified for decades. But his example lived on in training programs, in tactical manuals, and in the preparation of every signals operator who followed. If you found this story fascinating, please like this video and subscribe for more untold stories from World War II. What other acts of psychological warfare would you like to hear about? Let me know in the comments below.